Today's shiur begins 9 lines from the top of Daf Yud Zayin. Before we begin the actual Gemara, we glance at the side where we have a mivneh, a structural note written on the side of the Gemara. The trapezoid form appears. We sometimes refer to it as a volcano shape. And we've written 4 dugmos, or 4 examples, shohoyu mishurim, uma hoyu omrim. Now, mishurim means they would sing. There were, in our previous Gemara, we saw at the end of our previous shiur, the Gemara asking, Keitzim raktim b'fnei akala. Literally, how does dancing take place in front of the bride? Rashi added then what is said at the time that the public attempts to rejoice together with the kala. What is said? So in that spirit, we have the following Gemara, and in the Gemara we see number 1, Ki also Rav Dimi Omar. When Rav Dimi came, he said, Hochi mashru kame kalsa b'marova. The following is the way they would rejoice and sing in front of the kala, a bride b'marova in Eretz Yisrael. And in trying to praise her beauty, they would say as follows: Lo kal v'lo srak. Kal and srak are different types of cosmetics. Kal was a type of blue, maybe mascara, and srak was a rouge to give the ruddy or reddish complexion. Velo pirchus is lacking without any braiding of the hair or some type of hairdo. Rashi says kliyaser has to do with braiding of the hair. Vi'ales chen, and still she was a graceful gazelle, so that the praise of the kala in Eretz Yisrael was, we call, natural beauty. Even without the cosmetics and without the hairdo, she still is beautiful. Ki somchu rabbanon l'Rabbi Zera. Now there's a switch. Even though textually you'll see the same song was sung, but in a totally different context. When smicha was applied to Rabbi Zera, smicha is in English, someone might translate it as ordination, but it has to do with the rights given to a scholar, which applied during the times of the Tanoim and the Amoraim to a certain point in time, the right to rule and paskin over Dinei Knossos. They were given the title of Rebbe. So when Rebbe Zera achieved that status, Sharu Lehochi, they referred to him also in using this borrowed idea of natural beauty. Lo chav v'lo srak v'lo pirchus v'alas chen. We might term it as being we would call him a naturally great man without any falsehoods about him. Ki samchu rabbanon l'Rabbi Ami u'l'Rabbi Asi. When smicha, when this ordination was granted to Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi, shoru le'hochi. Shoru lehu, unto them they sung the following: Kol min dain v'chol min dain smochu lona. Anyone like these, a reference to Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi, the people like that, give them smicha for us. Lo tismuchu lanu, do not grant smicha for us to people that are lo min sarmisin v'lo min sarmitin. Rashi explains these words. Sarmisin are people that don't know how to give proper explanations. They give reversed, inverted explanations of things. Sarmitin, Rashi says, is a loshon of smartutin, people that are portrayed as rags. The Amri law, the Gemara continues with another version, v'lo min chamisin, v'lo min turmisin. Regarding turmisin, Rashi says lo aspires, it's not explained what that is, but the chamisin that the Gemara says are people that Rashi says give, from the word chamis or chomesh is a fifth. They give fifths of the reason. In other words, they give very incomplete explanations to their rulings. On the side of the Gemara, there's printed in from the Oruch. The Oruch was an early commentary, actually living possibly before Rashi a bit. He says that it's people that are shishayin chumsha shel maseches, people that don't learn complete tractates, people that learn only fifths of tractates and claim they learned the tractate. Well, don't give them the smicha either. We continue in the Gemara, number 4, Rabbi Avo, ki havu osi mi mesifta lebei Kesar. Rabbi Avo was, in addition to his being a great Talmudic scholar, he was also a governmental representative of the Jewish people to the secular government. So that when he went from the yeshiva, from the mesifta to the Beit Kesar, to the Caesar's palace, Nafkon Amsa de Beit Kesar, the Amsa is the bondmaids of the Caesar's house, La'apeh, went out to greet him, Umashrin Lehochi, and they would sing to him the following: Rabba the Ameh, Umadbarna the Umse. Rabba the Ameh is the president, the prince of his people, and Madbarna is a leader of his nation. Butsina da Nahora, the one with the glowing complexion. Brich Masyach Lishlam, blessed be your arrival in peace. Omru Alav al Rabbi Yehuda bar Eloi. And here we go back to different forms of festivity, of actions done in order to bring joy to a new couple, to a bride. On the side of the Gemara, you see under the Mivneh heading a crown shape. This represents Gimel Maisim, 3 incidents or stories, Shamashutuf Lahem, what's common to them, Shoyu Meraktin Bechatuna, that this involved dancing at weddings. The Gemara, Omru Alav Aribur Brabloi, Shoyanoitel Bad Shel Hadas Umarakid Lifnei Hakala. It was said regarding Rabbi Yehuda bar Eloi that he would take a myrtle branch and dance in front of the bride. The Omer, and he would say Kala Noah v'Chasuda, and he would say the pleasant and righteous bride. It's interesting that the myrtle branch was used in this context. You might say it's a pleasant-looking plant as well, and it certainly has a fine fragrance. And chasuda has to do with the chut shel chesed. If you were to be a bit homiletical about this, you might say that the hadas is actually a reference to the queen at the time of the Purim story, the famous Queen Esther, who was also known as Hadassah. And the Gemara in Megillah, amongst the different explanations regarding her name and her attributes, it says that she wasn't actually a beautiful woman, according to one opinion, but she had so much, she was so refined and so pious, there was a glow of grace that came over her that created an impression of beauty in the eyes of others. So that would fit in to the theme over here of why that particular plant was used, the hadas, the myrtle branch. We continue in the Gemara. Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak Meraked Atlas. He would dance with 3 myrtle branches, and Rashi describes his dancing as actually a juggling act, throwing one into the air, and while the other was in the air, would catch another one in a juggling fashion. Omar Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera, seeing Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak, who was a major luminary of that time, upon seeing him conduct himself in this rather frivolous fashion, he said, Komachsif lon Saba. Saba is the sage. The sage, you, the sage, are embarrassing us. You being the leading luminary and representative Torah scholarship, and you're conducting yourself in this rather frivolous fashion. It's bringing shame unto the rest of us. Kinoch nafshe, when Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak eventually died, Ifsik amuda denura, a pillar of fire separated him, bein didei l'kulei alma, between him, between his body and everyone else. Ugmiri, and there is a tradition, lo afsik amuda denura, elo ilachad bedara, ilatrei bedara. This unusual phenomenon does not happen other than to 1 or 2 in a generation. And now commenting again, Rabbi Zera, Rabbi Zera, Hanyolei, and you'll see in the next couple lines there's a play on words. And Rabbi Zera said, Ahanyule shutise l'saba, v'amri lo shtuse l'saba, v'amri lo shitse l'saba. Each one of these is a reference to Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak, and Rabbi Zera says, you know what enabled him to be set off from everybody else? For the shutise, the first one, shutise, is the branch, a reference to his dancing with the myrtle branches, his total foregoing of any self dignity in order to bring joy to a new couple. So this, so the branch, shutise, a reference to the myrtle branch. That helped, that benefit, that was the special merit that he had, setting him apart from everyone else. On the second version, V'amri lo shtuse l'saba, was specifically his, and here you see Rabbi Zera recognizing that his conducting himself like shtus, like a shoita, like a fool, in fact, is that which enabled him to have this great merit, that he was willing to relinquish any personal dignity for this greater goal of bringing joy to the new couple. The Amri law, and the third version is shitse, means his practice, his shita, his practice and custom, again, bringing joy and relinquishing any personal airs about himself for this lofty goal. This is what enabled him to be set apart from everybody, as was represented by the Amuda Denura, the pillar of fire. Rav Acha Markiv Lo Akasve. Here's an interesting practice. Rav Acha would dance with the kala umarkid. And markid is to dance. He would place her upon his shoulders, something that might raise many eyebrows, but Rav Acha took the kala and put the kala, the bride, on his shoulders and danced with her. Amri le Rabbanon, the rabbis that were there, possibly students, maybe others that were there that are called the Rabbanon, they asked him, Anan ma'u lemevet hachi, can we do that also? And here, notice this very interesting answer. Amar lahu, Rav Acha says to them, obviously, it's the question is in place. It's this whole scene would be would arouse great and serious questions. What is this rabbi dancing around with a bride who, generally speaking, is in her maximum, is at her maximum beauty, as is the case with most brides, dancing around with her on his shoulders? So, can we do that too? Amar lahu. So he answered, I damyon alaifu kikshura. If the bride would appear to you like a beam of wood, meaning absolutely no arousal, just like a piece of dead wood, no sensual arousal. So if the kala would appear to you like that, l'chayit, then it would be allowed, v'ilo. And if she is not going to appear to you when you're putting her on your shoulders as a piece of wood, lo, then you can forget about it. It would be totally forbidden. Omar Rav Shmuel Bar Nachmani Rav Yehonasan Muter leistakil b'fnei kala kol shiva kidei lechabeva al baila. He says it's allowed for the public to gaze upon the bride during the 7 days, the first 7 days since her wedding. Those are the 7 joyous days that we've spoken about quite a bit since the beginning of this Masechta. And one is allowed to gaze upon her in order to arouse her husband, her new husband, when he sees everyone looking at her, so that will arouse in him her beauty. However, the Gemara is not approving of this particular practice. The less Hilchos HaKavosei, the halacha does not follow Rav Shmuel Bar Nachmani. And I think that many of us could appreciate why this is not something that the Gemara itself accepts as a practice. Even though the Gemara itself doesn't say that, coming on the heels of the story with Rav Acha, it could very well be that Rav Shmuel Bar Nachmani was also of the same thought, that he was doing so with this pure. It was motivated by very pure intention, and certainly no sense of arousal taking place within himself. But to say that as a general practice and advice for the public, that would be going a little too far in the eyes of the final ruling of the Gemara. We glance at the side, we see a topic heading, Hanhogos Hakshurim. These are practices that are related, Lohitzoas Hameis Vachnosas Kala, for the carrying of the deceased out to burial, and likewise the accompanying of the bride to her wedding. I say likewise, maybe I should say lahavdil, in contrast. But the Gemara says, Tanu Rabbanan, Mavirin es hameis milifnei kala. If there are two groups, one accompanying a deceased to his burial, and one group accompanying a kala from her house to the site of her wedding canopy ceremony, they call it the wedding, and they don't want to intermingle with one another, and they end up their en route to their respective destinations, and they end up meeting en route. And instead of walking together and intermingling, so the source says that the people carrying the mace should take a turn off the path, allowing the group accompanying the bride to her wedding to proceed ahead, so that. And with that, they'll avoid their intermingling. But you see, who is giving way to the other? The funeral entourage is giving way to the kala. V'zeh milifnei melech Yisrael. And if and each one of these, if it's a funeral entourage or a wedding procession that encounters a king en route, so they are to give way to let the king go ahead. It was said regarding King Agrippus. He was a king in the later part of the second Beis Hamikdash period of time. It was said regarding him, she'ovar milifnei kala, that he gave way to a wedding procession. V'shibchu chachamim, and the sages of his time praised him for that. The Gemara asks Shibchu, and here notice the Gemara raises a question that lasts a few lines. The Gemara asks Shibchu. They praised him for giving way to the wedding procession. Mechlal de Shapirova, that would imply that he did a good thing. The fact that the Chachomim, the sages of that time, praised Agrippus, that would imply he did the right thing. But Ravashi taught otherwise. Even according to the opinion that a Nasi is a type of leader of the Jewish people. If you want to call him a prince, a president who forgoes the honor due to himself, his honor is foregone, meaning he is allowed to forego the honor. Melech shemocha kvodo, a king who forgoes the honor due to him, ein kvodo mochel, he does not have the right to forgive honor due to him. The Omar Mar, the Gemara quotes a source, basically a pasuk with an explanation. Som tosim olecha melech. The pasuk in describing kingship says that you shall place upon yourself a king, and the pasuk uses a double expression, som tosim, and from this we learn shetei a moso olech, you shall place the king above you, upon yourselves in many different forms, including the honor that you are to show to him must be permanent, non-negotiable, forgiving, and his fear must be upon you. You must place the king's fear upon yourselves, indicating no foregoing of honor that is due to him. So how could the sages praise Agrippus for giving the honor due to him in favor of the wedding procession? The Gemara says, Proshas drochim havoi. apparently they had met one another. These two groups, the wedding procession and the king's procession, met at a crossroads, and the king veered off at the crossroads, Proshas Drachim, in such a way that it didn't give the impression that he was giving the right of way to the wedding procession, but rather that was the route he had intended to take in the first place. So it didn't appear that there was any compromising of the royal honor. Tonu Rabbanon. Mevatlin Talmud Torah lehotzas hameis ulachnos eskala. The study of Torah can be canceled momentarily for the purpose of accompanying a funeral procession or accompanying a wedding procession. Hachnos eskala, accompanying the bride from her house to the wedding site. Omru alav al Rabbi Yehuda bar Rabbi. It was said regarding Rabbi Yehuda bar Rabbi, who, by the way, you can see in Maseches Sanhedrin, was one of the most diligent Torah figures of all time. This extremely diligent scholar, when it came to the accompanying of the deceased, or accompanying of a bride, he would forego his Torah learning at that moment. When is this stated? In other words, we'll say leniency with regard to the Torah learning, or when is this requirement of stopping one's Torah learning stated? That's when there isn't kol tzarcho, there aren't the full number, the complete number of people expected to accompany the mace are not present. Avol yesh imo kol tzarcho, if all those that are necessary are there, ein mevatlan, then you don't stop your Torah learning. The kama kol tzarcho, how many is that? What is meant by kol tzarcho? As you can see, a series marking appears on the side under the mivneh heading. You see a triangle, and we've written under the mivneh deos. These are opinions. Bameh shiur kol tzarcho binyan mosai mevat talmud Torah lohotzas hameis. I should say it's a deos bekamo shiur kol tzarcho. What is the shiur of kol tzarcho? So the Gemara, Omer of Shmuel bar Ini, Mishmei de Rav, in the name of Rav, he says, Tracer Alfi Gavri, Vishisa Alfi Shipuri. Tracer Alfi is 12,000 men, and Shisa is 6,000 shofar blowers. The shofar was blown, Rashi says, Machrizin olav shiavo lechabdo. This was used as an instrument of announcing for the public to come to honor the deceased. So you'd have to have, if they had 12,000 men and 6,000 shofar blowers, that's your kol tzarcho. Another version is Tleisar Alfi Gavri. Tleisar is 13,000. And there's another girsa also of Treisar Alfi, 12,000 men, Uminayu Shisa Alfi Shipuri, and from amongst them you would have 6,000 shofar blowers. So that according to the second version, it wouldn't be a total of 18,000, 12 and 6, but rather a total of 12,000, and of them, amongst them, you would have 6,000 of them were shofar blowers. Ula, Omar Kigon. Now, Ula is another explanation, another pshat in what kol tzarcho would mean. He says, Kigon de chaitzi gavri. Chaitzi, like the word mechitza, a wall of men, mi abula vi'ad sichra, from the gates of the city to the grave. The cemetery was located outside of town, so if there were enough people to form a human chain, a human wall, from the gates of the city to the grave, that's called kol tzarcho. Then you, if you're involved in Torah study, you don't have to stop. Rav Sheshes v'itemo Rabbi Yochanan Amar. This is another version by way of what does kol tzarcho mean. Netilasa kinesinasa. the removal of the soul, meaning death at the point that a person dies, so he no longer can study Torah. So we'll say it's the taking away of Torah is like the giving of Torah. Just like the Torah was given in the presence of Shishim, 60 ribo, 10,000, which we say 600,000 people. So too, the honor accorded to the deceased is 600,000. Vahani mili, this idea that there's an upper limit, an upper number, Laman dekori vitoni. This is the honor we accord to one who has learned scriptures. Vitoni learned Mishnayos. Rashi adds at the bottom, he says, Vitoni Mishnah, he's learned Mishnayos, but he hasn't reached a stage where he's actually taught it to others. The Gemara continues at the top of Omid Beis, Avolaman de Masni. Masni is a reference to one who taught others. Less lay shiur, then there's no upper limit with regard to how many are expected to be there to give him his due honor. V'im yesh edim shiotza mihinuma. Here the Gemara quotes the Mishnah that says if there are witnesses that can say that the kala, that the bride was yotza behinuma, then she will be able to claim the 200 zuz that is due to a basula, a virgin wedding. On the side of the Gemara under our topic heading, these are Shnei Pirushim al Mahu Hinuma. What does it mean that she yotza behinuma? My hinuma, the Gemara asks, what is a hinuma? Surchav bar Papa, Mishmei Deziri Omar, his name is Surchav the son of Papa, says in the name of Ziri, Tanura Da'asa. Rashi, on the third line from the top, Kemin Chupa Shel Hadas Hagula. A chuppah is a canopy. It could be, it's a reference to a marriage canopy that was made of myrtle branches formed in a circular fashion. So that if you have witnesses that saw the bride under a wedding canopy made of round formed myrtles, that would be a demonstration of it having been a virgin wedding. And Rabbi Yochanan Omar Karisa de menam nirma ba kalsa. Karisa is a type of veil. Rashi says Seif al rosha mishur b'valeneha. A seif is a type of a fabric that was placed overhead and fell below her eyes, which would be something very similar to what we would call a veil. And Rashi says Kamosha osin b'mikomenu, as we practice, was familiar to Rashi and his environs. Continue on the first narrow line. Upamim sheminam nemes b'socho. The kala would at times doze off. Mitoch she'eini now megulin, since people wouldn't notice her, she wouldn't be self-conscious if she otherwise would have been seen dozing off. L'kach nikra hinuma al shem tinuma. Tinuma means to doze off. And the word hinuma is similar to the word tenuma. The Gemara continues. Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka Oimer, af chiluk kloyos raya. A wedding in which you see the distribution of roasted grains to the children present. This is also a sign of it having been a wedding of a basula. Tana, beYehuda raya. The signs that were mentioned in the Mishnah were in fact practices in the Yehuda region of Eretz Yisrael. That's what they used to do in Yehuda as a sign or demonstration of this being the wedding of a virgin girl. Bebavel Mai, we have a double underline, and this is explained on the side under the Nosei Mivne heading. Me'achar sheshoninu dehinuma v'chilu kloyos heim simonim de besula niseis. Once we've established that these are signs of a virgin wedding, then our Gemara just stated that this is in the Yehuda region. Mahem hasimonim, what are the signs lebesula beBavel and lealmona? What about a virgin wedding in Bavel? Or later, what about a widow wedding? What are the signs that the woman marrying now is a widow? So we continue in the Gemara. The Bavel, what was done in Babylonia to demonstrate, to show that this is a Basula wedding? Omar Rav. So Rav explains, Dardugi de Mashcha Aresha de Rabbanon. Mashcha is oil. Then Rashi says women would place oil in the heads of the Torah scholars, and they would rub it in their heads. Shafos is what Rashi says. So Rav just explains what they did in Bavel. A very interesting practice. The women present poured some oil in the heads on the heads of the Talmidim. Omar lei Rav Papa Labaye. Rav Papa commented on this practice, and he said to Abaye, he said, Mashka de chafifusa komamar. Is this shampoo oil that they were doing over there? Rashi says, Shemen shel besomim. It's a fragrant oil that's shemesukon lechafifus, which is prepared for shampooing, for washing one's hair. Komar chibale chafifus hein lasuchan shemen. In Rav Papa's eyes, this was some type of. It looked to him like people that needed to wash their hair. So that's what was done. Omar lei. Abaye says back, Yasma. Yasma literally is an orphan, but he says, "Are you're an orphan from this practice?" Meaning, you're not familiar with this practice. That's how you're reacting to it. Lo avda leich. Imech dardugi mashcho aresha darbon b'shas ma'isa. When you got married, your mother didn't see to it that this practice was done. Kiha de'ahu merabonon di'asik le lebrei bei Rabba Barula. There was a scholar that was arranging his son's marriage, preparing the wedding of his son in the home of Rabba Barula. The Amrila, another version of this is Rabba Barula Yasik Le Librei Bei Hahu Rabbanan. That Rabba Barula was getting his son's wedding ready in the home of a certain scholar. V'dardig Mishcha Aresha de Rabbanan B'Shas Maisa. And at the time of the wedding, this is exactly what they did. So it seems to be a rather long-term practice. From Rav's time, Rav was the beginning of the Amoraic period, and he was already saying that this practice existed in Bavel, and it continues down to the latter Amoraic period. As you could see, Abaye speaking to Rav Papa was, relatively speaking, it was many years after Rav. The Gemara continues, Armalta Mai, what about the wedding of a widow, a woman who had once been married and now she's remarrying? What sign was done to let it be known that this was an almona getting married? Of course, as we've said in the past, the almona is entitled to a ksuba of only 100 zuz. So, in order to let that be known, what was done? Tani Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef teaches Armalta les lo kisni. At an almona wedding, there was no kisni or kloyos, no distribution of the roasted grains. So their absence was the sign. Umoide Rav Yeshua ba'omer lechavero v'chulei. In our Mishnah, we saw Rav Yeshua conceding that in the following case, the case that the Mishnah stated of a man coming up to someone out of nowhere saying that this field was your father's field and I bought it from him, that in such a case the speaker there would be believed. And the Mishnah went on to say, if there were Eidim, if there were witnesses that the field had belonged to this fellow's father, and the speaker says, well, I bought it from your dad, he would not be believed. And the halacha that Rav Yeshua is acknowledging, that if a person popped out of nowhere and said, this field was your father's, and he's speaking to someone who had no clue, he wasn't aware of it at all, and he shares that information, and he then qualifies and says, but I bought it from him, he is believed. That was called a pesh osar pesh hitir. Another term that we used was a migu. Believe him with this comment, because he could have simply remained silent and enjoyed the field without any protest whatsoever. We also had used an expression, in the reason for the believability there is because there was ein shor shachot lefanov. There was no grounds of suspicion of thinking anything about this field other than what this guy tells us. This was, of course, in contrast with a woman that said, I was raped after I had been married to you. And the thought was, and you saw other Tanai Rabbi HaRav Ozer believing her because she could have said a better claim. Rabbi Yeshua didn't accept that because there was already, before the claims were made, there was shor shachot lefanecha. There was already suspicion on the part of the chassan in that he didn't notice any signs of her virginity after their initial intimacy. There were no signs of besulim. So the absence of the signs of besulim is what creates grounds of suspicion, and hence the strength of the taina that she makes is significantly reduced in the eyes of Rabbi Yeshua. That's just by way of general recapitulation of what we have already learned. This sugya on the side is introduced with a nosei mivneh heading. You'll notice that throughout this sugya there is use made of a house shape, and the house shape will appear in an alternating direction. Sometimes the point facing up, sometimes it's flipped over. This we call a ma'akav. You'll also see a squiggle underline used to highlight the expression Moide Rabbi Yeshua. What happens in this sugya, the highlighting highlights the phrase Velisni Moide Rabbi Yeshua. Why not teach an alternative or a different kind of migu? And we've written on the side, Hatsois Chilufios, alternative suggestions, L'taina sheyesh bo migu, a claim that has the migu aspect. Migu meant it's a type of claim that ought to be believed because the speaker could have said something or done something or reacted in a more convincing fashion than he did. So since he had the potential of offering a more convincing claim, believe him in what he's saying right now. So we're going to suggest that couldn't another example have been given for a taina that has in it a migush Rabbi Yeshua yochel lahoidos lahaskim, where Rabbi Yeshua could have accepted and agreed shahato anom yehenamon, that one who places such a claim would be believed. So we'll see throughout the Gemara suggestions of alternative claims. As the Gemara goes on, you'll see a numbering scheme onto the side of the Gemara text. We have suggested here numbering 1, 2, and 3. 2 and 3 you see at the top of Yud Chesom and Aleph. The numbers 1 and 2, these suggestions 1 and 2, will be rejected. We've noted on the side Hatzos 1 and 2 are rejected. Nidchu is to be rejected. Biglal Shelohoya Yochol Lomar Seifa Shiei L'Tzorch, because the Seifa, which begins inevitably with the expression Im Yesh Eidim, if there had been witnesses, let's just like we saw in our Mishnah, where we said if there had been witnesses that the field belonged to the father, then the taina falls away. The claim made is loses its strength, loses its. We can't rely on it because witnesses already provided that information that the claimer is stating. So in constructing these suggestions, not only is it important for us to present a suggested claim, but it would also have to be accompanied by the seifa structurally, just like we saw in our Mishnah, that if there were witnesses, then we wouldn't believe. Well, what's going to happen then in the Gemara is after we give you suggestions 1 and 2, respectively, after each one of those suggestions, we're going to say, no, that wouldn't have fit into the scheme of our Mishnah because the seifa would not have had any purpose. I know that might sound a little bit abstract right now, but as we go through the Gemara, hopefully this will become much clearer. The inverted house, as we go through the Gemara, represents the chios or tshuvos, their rejections or responses of what had been suggested previously. So let's get ready for a pretty vigorous give and take structure Gemara by turning now to the Gemara text. Velisni, why not teach the following? You'll notice that we have a dashed frame. The reason for this is that this is not a source. It's simply a suggestion of what the source, how the source would have appeared had it been a source. Velisni, why not teach as follows? Moide Rabbi Yeshua, b'yomer lechavero. A man comes up to some fellow and says, Sodezu shelcha haisa ulekachti amimcha. This field was yours. This would be even more impressive. It's instead of what we saw in our Mishnah, he says this field was your father's field. The guy says this field was yours. But I bought it from you. And obviously he's going to someone that had not raised any question about the field ownership until this up till this very moment. And what happens is some guy comes out of the blue saying this field was yours, but I bought it from you. So is that not believable? In other words, he's believing when he says that because the guy who's claiming ownership of the field could have just been quiet and continued enjoying the field. So now that he's volunteering this information, this field was once yours, but I bought it from you, certainly he should be believed. Why isn't this taught? The Gemara answers, Mishum de kaboy lemisni seifa. If the Reisha was taught as we just suggested, you'd also have to follow it up with a seifa as follows. Im yesh edim shehi shalo, if there were witnesses that it belongs to him, to this listener. The hu omer, and the speaker says lokachtia mimenu. But I bought this from you. Eino nemon, he would not be believed. The second party, the listener, his access to the field, his association with the field is not based on the speaker whatsoever. It's based on the fact that there are witnesses that could testify thusly. And therefore, with this person claiming that he bought it, he wouldn't be believed to say he bought it. Heichi domi. What are the circumstances? What's the background? If this speaker who's claiming I bought it from you happened to have used the field, achla means he used the field, literally he ate the field. It means he cultivated the field, he harvested the produce, he did all kinds of actions that if he weren't the real owner certainly would have been aroused to protest this guy's presence. So if the speaker has used the field, shnei, the years. Shnei means shonim shel, the years needed for chazaka. Chazaka means, in practical terms, it's the use of a field over the course of 3 years. There's the third parak of Bava Basra deals with this topic quite extensively, but Rashi says very simply, Shnei Chazor Shalosh Shanim Shetiknu Chachomim L'chol Machzikim Bekarka the Mishachol Shalosh Shanim Below Irur, a person who used a field for 3 years without any protest, Neman Lomar, he is then believed to say, Lokachtia, this field, I happen to have purchased the field, the Avad Shtori, and I lost the title document. The Kulei Hai Lo Mizdayer Inish Bishtar. A person is not expected to watch his deeds for more than 3 years. So, if the speaker in this case specifically, a case where there had been witnesses that it belonged to the other guy, but over the last 3 years or more, this speaker who claims he bought it happened to have used it without protest, then why would you conclude he's not believed? The hypothetical source wouldn't have concluded Eino Naaman, the Delo Ochla Shnei Chazaka, and if this speaker had not used the field for 3 years, Pshita Delo Meheman, then it would be obvious. You wouldn't need a source to teach me that he would not be believed. A person would claim, well, I bought it from you. We simply would say, if it's within a 3-year period, we'd say, where's your title of deed to the field? And if you can't show it, then you're a fraud as far as we're concerned. So I wouldn't need to teach something that's obvious. So at this point, then, we understand why the suggested migu that Rabbi Yeshua would supposedly have accepted is rejected as a suggestion. That be either the conclusion of Eino Naaman would not be accurate, or it would be too obvious, you wouldn't need to teach it. The Gemara asks, regarding the case that we do state in the Mishnah where the speaker referred to the field being this guy's father's field at one time, how's that such a good example? In the Seifa, where it said if there were witnesses that it was this guy's father's field at some time, if the speaker, the claimer, happened to have used it for 3 years, why would the conclusion be he's not believed just because there are witnesses that it happened to be the guy's father's field? And if the speaker did not use it for 3 years, and then it's obvious that he would not be believed. So regarding the Seifa, where it says he's not believed, you'd have to say we're talking about circumstances that he didn't use it for 3 years. Otherwise it would be obvious that he's believed. You wouldn't. Otherwise, it wouldn't be taught Eino Naaman. He would have been believed. So the example as we have it seems to be lacking as well. Either the statement in the Mishnah of Eino Naaman is inaccurate, or it would be obvious. The Gemara responds, and that's why we have this inverted house. Bishlama Gabi Oviv, the Mishnah needs to teach the case regarding the father. Mishkachas law, you can have a situation where someone actually used it for 3 years, and we will still be able to conclude he's not believed. Namely, if there were witnesses that it was this guy's father's field, even though the speaker, the guy claiming it as his, used it for 3 years, he still would not be believed. And what's the case? Where he used it for 3 years in total. The first 2 of those years were during the lifetime of the father. The 3rd year of the chazaka, the 3rd year of use, the man had died, but the son was alive. And that will not constitute a chazaka, a sign of ownership. We said before, in passing, but it's important to emphasize, that in order for a chazaka the 3-year use to be considered the sign of ownership, it has to be a form of usage that would have prompted the owner to protest if this guy using it was a fraud. If your form of usage or the situation of your usage would not have prompted the protest on the part of the real owner, then you, the user, cannot claim ownership based on such a use, even though we're talking about a total of a minimum of 3 years. And what's the case? We just mentioned a case where the first 2 years was when the original owner was still alive, and the 3rd year, the son of the owner was alive, was present. Based on Rav Huna, which we haven't explained yet, what's the weakness, what's the lacking in this case? The Yomer Rav Huna, ein machzikin benichsei kotten, afilu higdil. A kotten is a minor. A minor is not someone that has das, that has full awareness of financial matters, of many matters in general, and hence you can't expect him, the minor, to protest. He's just a child. This halacha applies even if, let us say, you were using a field for a number of years in the presence of the child, even if he reaches adulthood. Higdil means he reaches above bar mitzvah and you continue using it. Since you started using it at a time that the child didn't have awareness, the fact that he became an adult doesn't mean he acquired awareness concerning your use of the field. He thought that as a child, he thought that you belonged there, not realizing that you're really a fraud. So Rav Huna says you cannot gain a chazaka through your use of the field if the owner of the field is a minor, even if you continue the use of the field when that minor turns into an adult. So the circumstances of the Mishnah, where we said if there were witnesses that it belonged to the father of this guy, the guy that is listening to the claim being made, if there are witnesses that belong to his father, even though the speaker who's laying claim to the field used it for 3 years or even more, since the start of his use was when the father was alive and the child was a minor, there is no chazaka to be gained. There are only 2 years of use, which is not enough to constitute ownership. 2 years of use in front of the formal owner. True, the child was an heir to it, but you couldn't have expected him to raise any protest. And I know we've said it before, a chazaka is not a chazaka unless it's a form of use that potentially could have aroused the protest of the owner, and in this case, the owner is the son. So that, as the Mishnah said, if there were witnesses that it was the father's, then this guy's claim would be of no validity. You notice that we have a bracketed section, and right after the brackets, the Gemara continues with a question. Within the brackets, we note on the side, Sograyim l'shem dilug. The skipping is for the brackets are for skipping purposes. K'dei lishma ritzifus hamasu matan, in order to make maintain the flow, the fluency of the give and take style of the Gemara. But within the brackets, yesh kushi partani al dvarav shel Rav Huna. There's a detail, a specific question regarding Rav Papa. So, if we skip momentarily, as far as justifying our Mishnah the way it is, with a fellow laying claim to a field by saying, this field belonged to your fathers and I bought it from him, he'd be believed, but if there were witnesses, so he would not be believed. So, we've established the validity of the Mishnah, and its validity is really based on accepting Rav Huna's principle. after the brackets, on the first wide line, the third word, v'lisnei b'didei, why not teach a claim regarding the field was yours? V'lukma kagon shoch l'shtayim b'fonav v'achas shelo b'fonav v'kagon sheborach. We'll go over that momentarily. We'll go over that. What's this like? We'll call this new suggestion within this particular give and take setup. In the brackets, the Gemara wants to understand why was it necessary for Rav Huna to state something that essentially is the Mishnah. Namely, our Mishnah, by telling us that if there were witnesses that the field belonged to this listener's father, the speaker laying claim to it would not be believed. The only way to explain the Mishnah, for the Mishnah to have a purpose, was to say that the claimer used the field for 3 years, the first 2 of which were during the lifetime of the father. The 3rd year was when the father was dead and only the son was alive. And that's not a way to gain a chazaka. So even without Rav Huna, I would have known that information, namely, ein machzikim b'nichsei katan. I would have known that from our Mishnah. So what do I need the Amora Rav Huna to tell me that? The Gemara now in the brackets. For Rav Huna masnisin also lashminan. Is Rav Huna coming to tell us information that you can learn from the Mishnah? Since that's the case of the Mishnah, which essentially is ein machzikim b'nichsei katan, and that's the only way to explain the Mishnah, what is Rav Huna coming to tell me something that's already contained in the Mishnah? Rashi points out 3 lines from the end of the narrow lines, V'dover hashoni b'mishnah, saying the things that are taught in Mishnayos, shogar b'fi hakol, was fluent in the minds of everyone. Everyone knew that. So isn't Rav Huna anticlimactic? Or superfluous? The Gemara answers, Ibo yasema Rav Huna, diyuka demas nisin ka'amar. It is true that you need to explain the Mishnah as we did, which is based on Rav Huna, but the Mishnah was not explicit about that. So what Rav Huna does is he reveals the explanation that the Mishnah was maybe hinting to at best, but it wasn't explicit. So I need Rav Huna to bring out, to clarify the Mishnah. Another approach is that Rav Huna tells me the following: Afilu higdil komash malon. That is not what I would have learned necessarily from the Mishnah. Rav Huna adds that you cannot gain a chazaka by continued use of the field of a cotton, even if you continue the use over a period of time that the cotton already reaches adulthood. Since the beginning was at a time you couldn't expect the child to protest simply because he was a minor, the fact that he became an adult, there is not reason for expecting him to protest. Once you start off in a state of ignorance, that state continues even as the original owner, the child, reaches adulthood. So I need Rav Huna for that particular point. We continue with our questioning scheme. V'lisnei b'didei. Why not teach the case of the field, the claimer saying this field was yours, but I bought it from you. V'lukma kegoin sha'ochla shtayim b'fonav v'achas shelo b'fonav, and set up the case where he used it 2 years in this fellow's presence, the listener's presence, and the 3rd year the listener was no longer there. Ukegon sheborach. Why was he not there? Because he had to run away. And what the chiddush would be that, of course, if there had been witnesses that this field was once this listener's, the chiddush would be that third year would not count as a completion of the chazaka years. The Gemara rejects this scenario as follows: Borach machmas ma. You say that at the third year of use, so the listener ran away. Why did he run away? Ida borach machmas nefashos. If he ran away. But by the way, take note of the fact that we're in the middle of a very long rejection of the suggestion. Takes quite a few lines of help, but most of it you'll see ends up in a bracketed section. So we're saying that to set up the Rabbi Yeshua Taina Nigu case like this, that the claim is made, as we said, this field was yours, but I bought it from you, and yes, he used it for 3 years, and we would then say, but if there were witnesses that it was once this guy's field, the claimer would not be believed. But if he used it for 3 years, why is he not believed? Well, we said that the third year, the owner here had run away, and that weakens the chazaka. Well, what were the circumstances of this listener having run away? Ida barach machmas nefashos. We're on the second wide line of the Gemara. If he had run away because of fear of his life, Rashi says that he was afraid for his life because the Malchus, the government, was out after him. So then, Pshita delo mehemon delo matzimachi. Of course, the claimer is not going to be believed. Namely, of course, there is no chazaka because the owner, he was on the run and he had to remain hidden. If he were to issue a protest, his whereabouts would be discovered and his life would be in jeopardy. So of course the owner could not have protested. As we said before, a chazaka, the demonstration of use as a sign of ownership, is only as good as use that would have aroused protest. But in this case, the original owner was running for his life. He couldn't have protested. And if he had run out of the community because he was under some type of financial threat, not that his life was in jeopardy, but he wanted to spare himself of someone collecting money from him. Rashi says, "Mitzakas hatsoya kimbiru." He was running away from people that were screaming at him in town. Then he should have issued a protest from the distance. To came along, we hold that machal shelo b'fanav, a protest issued by an owner concerning someone's presence on his field, that's done even at a distance, not in front of the squatter or the user. Havya machal, that constitutes a good protest. We didn't mention before, but the protest is designed to put the user of the field on notice that if he claims to be legitimate, he has to watch his title of deed. So he could have made this protest at a distance. And if he didn't make the protest, so of course the chazaka is a good chazaka. And as we said before, there would be no need to teach something that's obvious. So the suggestion made over here of teach this as, instead of this field was your father's, rather this field was yours and I bought it from you, it wouldn't hold up, because in the Seifa we wouldn't be able to teach that if there were witnesses that it was this guy's field, then the claimer would not be believed. And as we said, you would have had to set it up in this way with the 2 years and the 1 year, the total of 3 years use, with the Borach situation. But either, as we said before, either the conclusion of Eino Ne'emon would be either too obvious or it would be inaccurate. There's a long bracketed section, and you can see how long it is. Use your bracket length indicator. This will take us to the top line of Yud Ches Amud Aleph. Within the brackets, the Gemara discusses the issue, the basis of this concept of Macho Shelo B'Fanav Havya Macho. So it gets involved with that. It's really a side discussion. We noted on the margin by the starred note that Sograyim Elu Einon L'Shem Dilug. There is the brackets here are not for skipping purposes per se. It's simply to show that the main rejection ends at this point. The rejection of this suggestion of lisnei b'didei. That which is presented in the brackets, who reka ledin macho shelo b'fonav havya macho, and it has its background to this law concerning the protest made by an original owner, protest made from the distance, to serve notice to the squatter, the user, to watch the title of deed, is a formal, acceptable type protest. And a protest made within the 3-year period of use is in effect sufficient for putting the chazaka on hold, for preventing the chazaka from achieving, we'll say, the 3-year maturation point. At the top of Yud Ches Amud Aleph, we're going to have a new type suggestion. Up till now, number one, the house number one, till that point, dealt with a suggestion: why not have the person claim that the field was yours instead of mentioning the field was your father's. Approach number two has to do with cash and a loan, money owed as opposed to a field. But up till that point, before we get to that, we go back to the bracketed section. The last point that was made was that a macho shelo b'fonav havya macho, protest made by an original owner, is considered a formal protest. Disnan, the Tanaic source reads as follows: Sholosh ha'arotzos l'chazaka. There are 3 land regions that have significance with regard to matters of a chazaka, which essentially means that if you are using a piece of land in one of these land regions and the original owner is in another one of these regions mentioned, you would not be able to gain a chazaka, and that itself would seem to run counter to the idea of macho shelo b'fonav havya macho, but don't worry, we'll explain that. So this source speaks about 3 land regions regarding matters of chazaka. Yehuda, v'Ever HaYarden, v'Hagola. The 3 land regions are Judea, Ever HaYarden, the other side of the Jordan River. Here, of course, we're focusing on Israel. V'Hagolil, and the Galilee, the northern part of Israel. If the original owner was in Yehuda and some user of the field, when we speak about the user of the field, this is a guy that's inevitably claiming that he bought it, and he's using it in Golil, or Begolav Yichzik Yehuda. The original owner is in Golil and the user is in a field in Yehuda. Eino chazaka ad she'imoy b'medina. It's not the user is not going to be able to gain a chazaka, which, if he claims to be an owner of it, he'd better watch his title of deed for many years, ad infinitum. He's not going to gain a chazaka through his use of it. We mentioned before that a chazaka is use that would prompt an original owner to protest your presence. But if the original owner is not aware of your presence, is not expected to be aware of your presence, so that your use of the field is not going to establish a chazaka, it's not going to establish a sign of ownership. V'havinon ba. And now we ask, this source had told us that it's not a chazaka until the owner is located in the same region where his field is, that's being used by someone else who is claiming to have bought it. V'havinon ba, and we ask, my kosavar, what's the thinking of this source? If the thinking is that a long distance protest, a protest that's not made to the face of the user, is considered a protest is considered we'll say a serving of warning, then afilu bihuda v'golil nami, even if they're split, namely owner in one region and field in the other region, it should be considered a good protest. The ikosavar, I say a good protest means a type of protest that would stall the chazaka from forming. The ikosavar macho sheloi b'fanav lo havya macho, and if the Tana of this Tanaic source is of the opinion that a macho that's not issued in front of the user is not considered a macho, in other words, long distance serving of notice is of no effect, then afilu Yehuda v'Yehuda nami lo, then even if the owner and the field that's being used are together in the same region, so it would not be considered a protest. And if a protest, just to repeat the theme that we've been referring to already a few times, that if a protest is not considered a protest, then the lack of the protest would not be a sign of this fellow gaining a chazaka. Only the lack of a protest that would have been effective would be the grounds for establishing a chazaka, where we're simply saying, the owner, if you really felt that the field was still yours, then you should have protested. But if you can't expect him to have protest because macho shelo b'fanav wouldn't be considered a macho, so the user isn't going to be able to claim a chazaka because of the silence of the owner. So why is this source featuring specifically two separate regions? Even within the same region, the law would apply. Omar Rabbi Abba Bar Momo Lioilum Kosover Macho Sheloi B'Fanav Havya Macho. The Tana holds that a serving of notice does not have to be done in front of the user in order to be considered a macho, in order to be considered an effective serving of notice. This Tanaic source is dealing with a time of public emergency. Public emergency is a situation where there is basically no communication from one locale to another. In order for a macho shelo b'fanav to be effective, you'd have to have a constant flow of communication from one part to another. And if the roads are blocked, so the macho cannot be effective. Rashi says at the second line from the bottom, B'shas chirim shonu, the owner could say, lo nigleisli, that is, the user can say, lo nigleisli machoso sheshmor shtori. I was not aware of his protest that would have enabled me to watch the shtar. So those are the circumstances of this Tanaic source. Umayshno Yehuda v'golul denokit. If it's a shas cherum, so then even from one city to another, it wouldn't be considered an effective macho. Two cities, even in the same region, would be lacking any information flow or communication. So why does the source teach two different areas, two different regions? The Gemara answers the stam Yehuda v'Galil kishas cherum damu. The nature of these two regions was such that even without formal, let's say, emergency circumstances, there was simply no communication between these two areas. So for a person to have been considered to be served notice, if the field is in one location and the owner is in another location, that, in the case of Yehuda and Galil, would not have been an effective serving of notice. And now, as you can see, house number 2, a new suggestion for a taina with a migu that Rabbi Yeshua could have conceded to. For listening, Moide Rabbi Yeshua ba'omer lechavero, let Rabbi Yeshua concede where one says to his friend, Mono lovisi mimcho paraktiv loch shunemon. I borrowed from you $100, and I paid you back. That he would be believed. We mentioned before that Rabbi Yeshua is willing to accept a taina where there's ein shor shochet lefanecha. Why did Rabbi Yeshua seek out an example specifically of karka, of land, and as a result that, let's say, forced him into setting up a case involving the fellow's father, and all that because of the seifa regarding the witnesses, as we've already explained? Why not set up a case involving portables, metaltalin, and have the taina focused at the listener himself, as we just said, that if A approaches B and says, Mr. A says, I borrowed money from you, but I paid you back, he would be believed. So the reason that this particular case is not taught mishum de kaboy lemisna seifa, then this rejection takes a few lines to develop, because the seifa would have had to say as follows: Im yesh edim shu lava mimenu, if there were witnesses that saw the loan, the hu omer parativ, and the speaker says, I paid you back, Eino Namon. He would not be believed with such a claim. But that's not true. But we have a principle. When a loan takes place in front of witnesses, the borrower doesn't have to make sure that witnesses see the payback. Therefore, even if there were witnesses that saw the original loan, this claim of I paid you back on the part of the borrower would have been believed. So the setup, as our Mishnah has it, that because of the witnesses the claim would not be believed, isn't accurate over here. A third suggestion. Structurally, by the way, as we said in our introduction, I hope everyone notices that suggestions 1 and 2 fell away because of our inability to set up the seifa in these suggestions in the same format as the seifa that appears in our Mishnah. Suggestion 3. V'lisni Moide Rabbi Yeshua be'omer lechavero mono lo vicha biyadi ve'chaltiv pras shehu ne'amon. Person comes out of the blue and says, I once borrowed 100 zuz from your father. I owed him 100 zuz, and I paid him back 50. Pras means half. With a claim like that, should be something that Rabbi Yeshua should accept. That believe him when he says that, because he didn't have to say anything. The Gemara rejects this, but you'll notice it's a long rejection. Aliba deman. The Rashi points out, based on, of course, what you'll see very shortly in the Gemara, that this area, this topic, is the subject of a Tanaic controversy. And the problem is that what we just learned, what was just suggested, wouldn't conform to any of the Tanoim that are authorities on this topic. And before we go on in the Gemara, there's a little starred note that you might notice in the margin, and it reads as follows: L'Rebbe Yeshua nemon rak im lo tovoi. According to Rabbi Yeshua, the believability, as we said before, there's ein shor shochet lefanecha. There's no grounds of suspicion that preceded this encounter. That would mean that the believability is only if the fellow wasn't claiming anything, that the son wasn't coming along and saying, you owed my father money. So that's Rabbi Yeshua's opinion. There is another school of thought called the Rabbanon, Nemon afilu hechodetavo. The borrower would be believed even when there was a claim made against him. And a third opinion, Rabbi Ozer ben Yankov, boy shvua afilu hechad lo tavo. He goes so far as to say that the mere offering of this information is not going to be believed on its own unless he would take a vow to back it up. That's not like Rabbi Yeshua either. Rabbi Yeshua is granting believability on the simple volunteering of the information. According to Rav Ozer ben Yaakov, if you volunteer that information, at least at this point in our discussion, even where there's no formal taviyah, formal claim, you would still have to take a vow to back up your statement. That's not like Rabbi Yeshua. So the Gemara points out that to set up Rabbi Yeshua like this, where a person says, I owed $100 to your father, but in the course of time I paid him back 50%, I paid him 50 of them, that he should be believed. Well, Ali Badaman, according to whom would Rabbi Yeshua have been saying this? Ali Badarabonon, if it were a statement made within the Rabbanon, Ho Amri, the Rabbanon though don't go like that. They say Meshiv Aveda Have. Literally means this is an example of someone who is returning a lost article. And a person who is returning a lost article is not someone that you, as far as the Rabbanon are concerned, we have to say that the man would be believed even if there was a taviyah, even if there was a claim made against the fellow. If we look in the Rashi, there's a little triangle that you can see at the end of the one of the narrow lines in the upper part of the Rashi. The Ikar Rabbanon Amri Afilu Tovo V'zeh Moda B'Mixas. You can have a situation in this case where someone was making a claim. You owed my father $100, and this guy says, "Well, yeah, but I paid him back 50. I still owe 50. I still owe though." It's being nice. He's volunteering half the amount. Meshiv Avedahu. He is considered like someone returning a lost article. If someone comes and returns a lost article, you don't impose upon him the need to take a vow to substantiate his act. Disnan b'shvuos. It's taught in Masechah Shvuos. Rashi says, "Mona labo biyodcha." Guy comes up and says, you owe my father $100. Fellow says back. The borrower says, "Ein lecha biyodi ela chamishim dinar." There's only $50 that I still owe. Potter, he is exempt from taking a shvua. Mishum shu kemeshiv aveda. Now we didn't give a very essential point of information, but it's called, and it's going to be a theme of the next sugya in the Gemara. It's called moida b'mixas chayav lishava. That a person who admits half, it has to take a vow, and that arises in a simple or standard case where A approaches B. A says to B, you borrowed from me $100. That's what A says to B, and B says back, "Well, I borrowed $100, but I paid you back 50." He's conceding half, and when that happens, the Torah imposes upon a person to take a vow. The logic to that and all will be explained at great length in the next sugya. That's called moida b'mixas chayav lishava. However, where the claim is, you owed my father $100, and the guy says back, "Yeah, but I owe only 50 right now." He's called meishiv aveda. He's considered like someone restoring a lost article. And the reason, we'll see later on, the reason or the logic behind that is because he could have simply denied everything very easily. We call that kofir bakol, and he's being nice enough to admit that he still owes half. He is like someone restoring a lost article. And Rashi goes on, Umay Ashmina Rabbi Yeshua B'Ein Shor Shachot. Why would Rabbi Yeshua have to tell me his din? Namely, he concedes believability only when there's no one laying a claim. Even where a claim is being made, this fellow, the borrower, would still be believed. So the Gemara continues that Rabbi Yehoshua, as he is presented right now, doesn't conform to any of the formal authorities on this particular topic, and he'd be a third opinion that doesn't have any basis. The Gemara continues, aliba de Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, and if Rabbi Yehoshua was teaching this in accordance with Rabbi Ozer ben Yaakov, Omar, but he says, Shvua boy, you would have to take a vow. Your taina, your claim of having paid back half to the father, wouldn't be enough. And yet Rabbi Yehoshua is saying it is enough. The Sanya, and here the Gemara gives the background to the Rabbanan and Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. It says in the source, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, Pa'omim shodam nishbal tainas atzmo. Sometimes a person has to take a vow, even when it's his own claim. Ketzad mono lavicha biyodi v'chaltiv pras. This phrase, by the way, this whole source is going to be clarified by the Gemara later on. But in the meantime, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov is saying sometimes a person has to take a vow even on tainas atzmo. And what is that? Mono lavicha biyodi v'chaltiv pras. A person says that he volunteers this information. He says, I owed your father once $100, but I paid him back $50. Hareze nishba. He has to swear that was the case. V'zeu shenishba tainas atzmo. That's an example of someone who swears on his own words, his own claim. The Chachamim say that a person who speaks like that, he says, I once owed your father $100 and I paid him back $50, and I still owe him $50. That's an awfully nice guy. He's like someone restoring a lost article to someone, and he's exempt from taking a shvuah. So that at this point, this is the end of the formal rejection of the suggestion number 3 for Rabbi Yehoshua to acknowledge that as a type of pesh osar pesh itir, or a nigu taina that would have been believed. At this point in the Gemara, the Gemara will analyze the machlokes between Rabbi Ozer ben Yaakov and the Chachamim. What does Rabbi Ozer ben Yaakov really hold, when after all a person is nice enough to come up with information? I once borrowed $100 from your father, but I paid him back $50. Why in the world should he have to swear to back that up? And Mitzvah Shem in our next shiur, so we'll get into that discussion.